Sébastien Perouse. I'm a research professor here. I'm terribly sorry for this terrible voice I have today. So I'm extremely happy to have this workshop today on what we consider as a very important topic, which is hydrocarbons, governance, and social accountability in Russia and Central Asia, and actually beyond. We talk a lot, and there are a lot of publications on oil and gas extraction and on trade between hydrocarbons-rich countries and energy-poor countries which need to import to make their economy work. But we talk much less on the consequences of oil exploitation on the societies and how this resource is managed by the state. Many countries in the world are blessed with a large amount of natural resources under their soil. Oil and natural gas in particular have been responsible for the rapid economic growth in post-Soviet countries like Russia, like Azerbaijan, like Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan. But history has also shown that comparable windfalls in natural resources revenues in the long run often turn into a curse, and this has inspired the term curse of natural resources. Extensive research indeed shows that resource-abundant states are more often confronted with negative economic, political, and social outcomes than resource-poor states. Poor economic management by the state has often proven to lie at the heart of the problem. Corruption, rent-seeking, and a lack of accountability by the state correlate highly with natural resources abundance. These outcomes are obviously an impediment to the development of the states. As we have seen in several post-Soviet countries, attracting large amounts of foreign direct investments in the extracting sector led to rapid economic growth. Economic growth, however, is not the same as economic development, which happens, for example, when non-extractive sector becomes competitive and eventually become able to compete on global markets. Any state that is not abundant in resources is forced to move from economic reform to economic development to economic growth. If the state intends to experience economic growth in the long run, if the state intends to experience economic growth in the long run. So here again, this made several scholars wonder if natural resource abundance and its windfall gains are blessing or curse. But in the same time, successful resource-led development by, among others, Norway, Malaysia, and Indonesia tells us that the resource curse is anything but deterministic. Resource abundance clearly does not always lead to poor economic management. So this workshop today will investigate the role of natural energy resources in the development of hydrocarbon-rich countries and the way policy has been related and implemented and how the population reacts to the development of hydrocarbon resources, how these populations are taken into account by the governments in the management of oil and gas resources. Some researchers have, for example, written that natural resources revenues have historically proven to offer little incentive to invest in projects such as education. And today, there is a growing resentment among the population, for example in Kazakhstan, against the consequences of oil exploitation. But at the same time, we should keep in mind that the problem is not the existence of natural wealth as such, but rather the failure to avert the dangers that goes with the gifts of nature, as for example, Polly John Sloan and Erica Painter have shown in their book, Oil is Not a Curse, that they published a few years ago. So we will have today two panels. The first one this afternoon will be on hydrocarbons and governance in Russia, and the second one will be on oil, environment, and social accountability. I would like, of course, to thank our panelists who accepted our invitation to make a presentation today, some of them having traveled just to come and be with us today. But before starting the first panel, we are extremely delighted to have today as a keynote speaker Mr. Professor Marc-Antoine Perouse de Montclos. Marc-Antoine is a doctor in political science. He's a professor at the French Institute of Geopolitics at the University Paris 8. He's also a fellow at Chatham House, and he's a global fellow at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. He works for the Institute pour la Recherche et le Développement, so Institute for the Research and Development, and he's also a lecturer at Sciences Po Paris, which is the Institute for Political Studies in Paris. Marc-Antoine already worked a lot on issues related to hydrocarbons and social accountability. He's a specialist on Africa, and he organized several conferences on oil and social accountability, trying especially to show that hydrocarbons are not a curse. And Marc-Antoine today will talk about oil production, state instability, and violence in developing countries, the limit of the curse theory, and the need for further investigation. And before giving the floor to Marc-Antoine, I would like to thank the anonymous donor who gave funds to the Elliott School, and thanks to whom we could organize this workshop today. So now I will give the floor to Marc-Antoine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sébastien, and thank you very much to the Elliott School of International Studies to invite me here. It's quite a privilege for me to be here today at George Washington University. Actually, some years ago, I used to teach at an African university where there was no power at all. So here, everything works. It's quite like a wonderland to me. So thank you very much for this privilege. As Sébastien knows, we have a motto in France. We say that we have no oil but plenty ideas. And so yes, we have no oil but plenty ideas, and of course we're quite ambitious, so we claim that we have good ideas. So let me share some of these ideas on this challenge, which is to study the political and social impact of oil production, especially in developing countries. As you know, the conventional wisdom posits that oil production in developing countries brings economic failure, political instability, the inability to democratize, high levels of corruption, and a lot of evils, rising violence in the form of crime, interstate wars, civil wars, and so on. But we also know, and Sébastien mentioned some of them, that there are exceptions. You have petro-democracies, the US, the UK, Australia, Norway, Canada, and even if you look at developing countries, take countries like Brazil or Nigeria, it's quite striking to see that Brazil got more democratic when oil production was on the rise, and there was almost no oil production when the military were in power. Or look at Nigeria. Until 1999, there was a military regime, and oil production rose, as well as oil revenue in the 2000 when the country returned to a civilian regime. So clearly there was no correlation between the levels of oil production and the political change of regime. And vice versa. If you look at Venezuela, you know that Venezuela in the 1970s was one of the only democracies and parliamentarian regime left in Latin America. And Venezuela with Chavez have experienced a more authoritarian regime when precisely oil production declined. So it's quite paradoxical that clearly there is no coincidence between, and sometimes no correlation between the levels of production and political change of regime. But of course, I wouldn't claim that Venezuela became more authoritarian because there was a reduction or decline in oil production. And I don't think we could really claim that Nigeria became more democratic after 1999 because there was a rise in the oil production. So clearly, and this is one of the core issues I'd like to share with you today. I have two challenges. One is, how do we isolate the oil factor amongst many parameters to try to understand social and political change? And the second challenge is, how can we compare oil-producing countries in all their diversity? Can we really compare the US with Brunei or Gabon? I mean, does it make sense? So also this issue of comparing countries. Can we simply do it? And because I'm a very good researcher, of course I will have no answers to these questions. But at least I'll raise some issues we can share and we can debate about it. You know that the resource curse, as it was framed by Richard Hoty in 1993, and as it was translated by political scientists as a kind of political Dutch disease, posits that states that produce oil would see their non-oil economy to decline. That's the typical Dutch disease. They would be more dependent on international prices. And these governments in oil-producing states would rely very much on non-tax revenue, which makes them less accountable to their citizens, because the primary tax base of the rentier state is resources and not people. And of course, in this regard, oil and gas, because I'm always thinking of gas together with oil, I just say oil because it's easier, but I'm thinking about oil and gas, are a very specific resource. It's different, for instance, from coal. Coal mines in the 19th century, and some others have been talking about carbon democracy. Coal mines were a place where trade unionism developed a lot, and trade unionism bring the freedom of association. It was one of the fundamentals of democracy. But of course, coal mines, you had a lot of people working in coal mines, which is not the case in the oil industry. And that's quite different in this regard, because as we know, in the oil industry, the capital-labor ratio is quite low. So of course, the social impact is different as compared to other energy resources. So again, the idea is that states that produce oil are less accountable to their citizens. That's how it's framed in the oil curse theory. And so if they are less accountable, they could be more authoritarian because they do have the resources anyway to fund coercive regimes. So oil rents would promote authoritarianism and funds coercive machinery to repress dissent. And actually some authors, I'm thinking for instance of Jeremy Weinstein, even claim that this lack of accountability is not only for states, but even for rebel groups, whereby guerrillas that are based on resources commit higher levels of indiscriminate violence and abuses because they are not accountable to their people. Because of that, they would pay less respect to the international humanitarian law and would kill more civilians, because basically they don't rely on civilians to support the struggle, but on resources. So it's a bit the same idea as with the oil curse theory when it comes to the state. But of course, I was wondering, as a French, can we really say that the French resistance during the Second World War did pay attention to civilians because we had no oil? Well, I've never read that in any historian reading of the French resistance, so I wonder why we should apply this reading to developing countries, to explain that some guerrillas do kill civilians because they have no oil or no resources, or precisely because they do have resources, so they are not accountable to their people. I'm not really sure it works this way. Again, it's very difficult to isolate the oil factor in political patterns. And what I see in Africa, that it plays in both directions. The theories of scarcity of resources or abundance of resources. Scarcity played a role in the conflicts in Somalia or in Rwanda, and the abundance of resources, oil for instance, also played a role in Angola or Nigeria, which is rich with many resources. So where do we stand when it comes to oil production? I have actually 5 main problems with the resource curse or the oil curse theory. More specifically the oil curse, because we do deal with oil, and again, oil is different from other resources like coal or any other mineral resources. The first, as I already mentioned, my first problem has to do with the exceptions that contradict the oil curse theory. No, it's not all oil-producing states that are authoritarian or go to war or repress their population. It is not systematic. 2, we have a problem with correlations. This oil curse theory is usually proposed and framed by economists that like to have big systems to compare countries with various indicators and data. And sometimes there can be a confusion between correlations and causal links. And average can be misleading in this regard. So I'm going to show you that correlations can be misleading, and I'm going to teach you something very important. And you will be happy to attend this workshop, because at the end of the day, you will think, oh, I've learned something. Well, I've got a good advice for you. Tonight, when you go to sleep, don't go to sleep in the bed. You know why? Beds are very dangerous. Do you know that more than 90% of people die in their bed? So you shouldn't go to sleep in the bed. Tonight, you just sleep on the floor, right? Remember, you've learned something at this workshop, and you are very happy to attend this workshop because you've learned something. Of course, you would say, oh, that's quite ridiculous. It's not because you have a correlation that you have a causal link. So yes, the same with oil. I mean, you can have a war in an oil-producing country, but has it got anything to do with oil? I'm an Africanist, so I'm not familiar with Central Asia, not at all actually. I've been once to Iran, and I've been to Georgia, but I'm not very sure it is part of Central Asia anyway. So I've got really a lot to learn from you. That's also the reason why I'm quite enthusiastic in participating to this conference, to share experience from an Africanist point of view. But when I'm thinking about Azerbaijan, for instance, and again, I really know nothing about Azerbaijan, but I was just thinking, as far as I know, the oil fields are in the south, and there's a contest with Iran on the Caspian Sea. Now, the war on Karabakh, has it got anything to do with oil? Yes, oil funded the war machine of the Azerbaijani state, no doubt about it. But does it mean that you wouldn't have any war if there were no oil in Azerbaijan regarding Karabakh, where there is no oil, as far as I know? I'm asking you the question. You might have an answer. But of course, if you mix up correlation and causal links, if you have this economist view, you would just take the list of countries that produce oil and where you have a war, and Azerbaijan would be on the list. But as the war, does the war in Karabakh has anything to do with oil? I don't know, but I'd be most happy if you have an answer to provide. So clearly, we have to be very careful with this correlation, because we should not confuse them with causal links in the oil curse theory. My third problem, besides the exceptions and the limitations of these correlations, has to do with contradictions. On one side, we are told, with the oil curse theory, that oil funds and reinforce authoritarian states. On the other side, we are told that oil provokes conflicts and weakens the state, up to the stage that some states completely collapse or are labeled as being a failed state. So on one side, oil reinforces the state, and on the other side, it weakens the state. Okay, what do I do with that? I don't know. All I know is that oil is ambivalent. Oil can result in different consequences, and that goes also not only for the structure of the state, but also when it comes to armed conflicts. Yes, oil can be a stake for wars, but we should also think that oil can help or facilitate peace in a way, because it can help to buy social peace, for instance, or it can even push belligerents to spare the assets. I'm thinking, for instance, about the civil war in Congo in the 1990s. Oil production is on the coast, so all the fighting was in the hinterland where you have no oil, because the belligerents wanted to spare the oil assets. So if you were flying to Congo in the 1990s, the best place for you to find a secure place was where the oil industry was, because the belligerents avoided to destroy this industry because they wanted to take their share of the revenue of this industry. So the idea here is that the same cause can trigger different results, different effects, because of very different parameters. Let me take the example of oil and secession. Just 2 or 3 weeks ago, Sebastian was there. We had this international conference with area specialists on oil in Paris. And we had one panel on oil and secession. And some specialists argued that, yes, oil is exacerbating the trend towards secession in northern Iraq, with Kurdistan, for instance, since they had oil production. They can be sustainable from an economic point of view. The same goes for the eastern part of Libya. And one of the participants to the conference quoted one of the leader of the secession in the eastern part of Libya, who claimed that the power should be where the oil is. That was how he framed it. And I thought it was very telling about the power of oil to support secession. And as you know, oil was also clearly one of the issues during the referendum for independence in Scotland. So yes, on one side, oil can exacerbate secession. And on the other side, it can also help to consolidate national unity. In the very same conference, for instance, we had someone who presented the case of the United Arab Emirates, where oil is clearly a factor of national unity. The same goes for Algeria, for instance, or even Mexico. Since Mexico nationalized its oil industry in 1938, this nationalization became a symbol of Mexican nationalism. So we see that the same coast oil production can produce very different effects. Secession, national unity, clearly we have no deterministic model in this regard. My fourth problem with the oil curse theory, besides the exception, the limitations of the correlation, and the contradictions whereby the same cause can lead to different results. My fourth issue has to do with the historical framework. We realize that in many cases, the political regimes were already authoritarian before the oil boom of the 1970s. In Algeria, Libya, or Iraq, Libya, Iraq, Algeria, Nigeria, that comes to my mind. So clearly, it shows that oil production can, and oil wealth, of course, can exacerbate some situation, but does it really lead to authoritarian regime when this authoritarian regime were already in place? On all the secessions I mentioned, Kurdistan, also Cabinda in Angola, existed before oil production. It's not the oil production as such that created the push for a secession. That goes also for Eastern Libya today. The trend, the push for a secession already existed before oil. So it is very important in this regard to look at the history of political regime and see how oil interfered in this regard. And let us not forget to study political regimes before oil production or before the oil boom. Because clearly institution matters. And the quality of institution is one of the key issues, of course, to see if oil could be a curse or a blessing, a boom or a doom. My fifth problem with the limitations with the oil curse theory is that this theory can only be tested in one way, the negative way. Oil would destabilize the state, would provoke war, but does it work the other way around? Can we say that if there was no oil, you wouldn't have wars? If there was no oil production, would you have a democracy? Well, I wouldn't be able to answer that. So it's clearly a limitation of this theory. It can be only tested in one way. And again, the main issue is, and that's really, I think, our common challenge today, how do we isolate the oil factor amongst many parameters to explain political and social change? We've got so many different parameters. Population. Of course, oil production doesn't have the same effect in Brunei or Gabon, small underpopulated countries, as compared to China or Nigeria. Nigeria is expected to become the third most populated country in 2050. The first one would be India, followed by China, and then third would come Nigeria. So of course, oil production doesn't have the same meaning and the same implications. I was recently in Congo, and coming from Nigeria. Nigeria produce, in the good days, they do produce 2.5 million barrels per day for 170 million people today. Then I went to Congo, and they produce 300,000 barrels per day. So I came and I was a bit arrogant and said, oh, this is really peanuts. Yeah, but there are 4 million people there, 4 million citizens. So of course, it's easier for an authoritarian regime with 300 barrels to fund coercion as compared for Nigeria to fund coercion for 170 million citizens to control. And that means something. So yes, population is of course a very important factor. Another one is geography. The social impact of oil production is of course very different if it's onshore or offshore. And the fact that it's offshore in Angola or in Congo also explained that the civil wars in this country were quite different as compared to other oil-producing countries where oil was onshore. And again, remember the case of Azerbaijan. If you look at the location of the oil fields, clearly it should raise the issue of the role of oil during the war in Karabakh. Another factor that we should investigate is the ownership of oil fields. Are they private? Are they public? That plays a role, of course. And finally, and also when it comes to the ownership of oil production, we should of course also investigate the system of redistribution of the oil wealth within the state. Which brings us, of course, to the core issue, to the key issue, which is the quality of institution in an oil-producing country. So let me conclude on this. I think we really need to develop a qualitative understanding and a multidisciplinary analysis of the social and political impact of oil production. And when I say a multidisciplinary approach, that means working together with economists, political scientists, geographers, sociologists, anthropologists, historians, yes, we do need them, and demographers. And we should work clearly also on a case-by-case basis. Because again, our two main challenge is one, to try to isolate the oil factor amongst many parameters to explain social and political change in oil-producing countries. But the second challenge is also to compare. How can we compare? That's really an issue I'd like to discuss with you today. Thank you very much for your attention.